Today's webinar is a follow-on, as Sarah said, from last week's webinar about narratives to help you build a budget to accompany any grant application, covering practical tips on linking budget items to project goals, and of course, how to avoid common pitfalls. As we do here at LMS, this session is about best practices. And of course, our Music in Action grant is currently open. And if you are planning to apply to our grant, we hope that you'll benefit from these strategies. Just a disclaimer that working with a grant writer, Aaron or otherwise, or following specific strategies is unfortunately no guarantee of funding. All of the applications to Live Music Society grant programs are reviewed by an independent jury, but we wish you the very best of luck. So let's begin, and feel free to use the chat throughout. There's a Q&A function, so you can ask questions as part of the Q&A function, or you can drop them in the chat. Sarah will read them out at the end, and we'll have time to address any questions. So it gives me great pleasure to introduce Aaron Henderson. Aaron serves as National Funding Lead with his current firm assisting industry clients in identifying, pursuing, and managing federal, state, local, and nonprofit grants. His primary interests lie in grant strategy, development, benefit cost analysis, project and program design, and climate risk mitigation. His support of his clients has ultimately resulted in obtaining and managing over $4 billion in grants and low interest loans. Aaron's going to share his screen and take it away, Aaron.
Thank you. Just to make sure, can everyone see my screen before we get started? Okay. All right, good. Yeah, thanks again. My name's Aaron Henderson. I've been working as a federal grant writer, or just a grant writer in general now, for over 11 years. I'm really excited to be here with Live Music Society. I think Music in Action is a really awesome grant source, but I'm always excited to kind of share what information I can to folks trying to learn, how to develop grants, how to write budgets, how to write grant narratives. Um, I would definitely encourage you, as it was mentioned, to check out the grant narratives recording that we did. I would kind of consider this a two-part series, to be honest. Both this presentation and the last presentation sort of, coalesce pretty well with one another, I think. But again, as mentioned, if you have any questions at the end of this, feel free to ask them. But, I can always be reached via cell phone or via email at the information here, and I'll have it at the end of the presentation too. But with that said, to get started, our agenda today is really just covering kind of four major topics. Number one, and probably most important, is what's the purpose of a grant budget? What is it? What does it entail? The second piece is kind of the five steps that I found to be helpful in developing a grant budget. The third is a discussion of what happens sort of after the fact if you win a grant application. What do you do budgetarily to set up for success, or even for potential audits? Sometimes audits happen, so it's important to kind of be ready and mobile for that. And then the fourth piece is kind of just some tips and tricks I've learned over this long time I've been doing this, and then we'll just have a Q&A piece for everyone. So the first portion of this is just kind of understanding what grants are, what the purpose is, and grants are, the budgets are really just one part of an overall grant proposal, of an overall grant application. But when it comes, especially to competitive grant funding, I would argue the budget is probably the most important part, and the part that you really want to have honed and dialed in for your grant reviewers. Um, so the purpose of a grant budget, it serves a lot of various purposes. Number one, it's a financial plan that outlines the estimated income and expenses that are associated to that project or program that you're proposing within the grant source. Number two, it really lays out a blueprint of how you intend to use the grant funds should you receive them, and how you're going to use those funds to achieve your project's proposed objectives. Um, Three is, well, it's a mandatory element of most grant proposals, and it just demonstrates your feasibility with your proposed plan, how you're going to be able to achieve those different objectives and different metrics. And then ultimately, I think it really serves as a benchmarking mechanism for you as the grant proposer to refer back to if you receive grant funding. So you have the ability to do sort of those checks and balances at any portion throughout the entire time you're working through your project or program that you've proposed. Um, so, in the eyes of just the grant itself, what is the purpose of the grant budget, right? With most organizations competing for grant funding, this budget proposal is going to be one of the more objective components of your overall application. It hopefully is going to include hard numbers that the funding agency or the reviewers can verify if they feel it's necessary. And it really provides you as an organization an opportunity to sort of exercise your financial responsibility. It gives you an opportunity to ensure that what you're proposing is not just feasible, like I mentioned, but also practical and reasonable given the constraints, your financial constraints. And then it really provides funding organizations and reviewers a way to sort of show that you're worthy of funding in their eyes, especially in comparison to other organizations. So again, it just provides a lot of opportunities to, provide some sort of proof of due diligence, ensure that project feasibility and practicality, and really just demonstrate use overall of how your organization is going to put those funds to work when compared to others that are also potentially applying for that competitive funding. So, with grant budgets, I think have distilled the development of these grant budgets to five pretty meaningful steps, and these are the ones that have typically worked with me. But there's always alterations to a methodology. So please, if you feel like you need to alter mine, feel free to do that. Step one is really understanding your funder's requirements. Um, the overall grant application needs to really align, and this goes back to what I mentioned in the narrative presentation. It needs to align with those interests, the scope, the objectives, the mission of that funding agency. But the grant budget generally requires adhering to specific requests or preferences, monetary preferences that are pointed out by the grant funding agency. Um, there's also, typically important requirements to consider when creating a budget proposal, and I'm going to go through each of these four, but ultimately you want to focus pretty heavily on the amount you're requesting, the format you're putting that budget in, what sort of budget type is expected, and then all of the different expense types, potentially matching funds and even potential revenue in certain grant sources. So specific to the amount requested, how much can or should you request from a funder? Oftentimes in any of these notices of funding opportunities or these grant opportunities that are released, there will be some kind of range or cap for specific activities or for specific programs or objectives. Um, Deciding on a reasonable cap, I think, is one of the most hypercritical parts of developing a budget, especially when putting that in front of a funding organization. I think it's really, really easy a lot of times to default to kind of asking for as much as you possibly can, when I do think there's a bit of nuance to that. I think, again, being able to really, really nail down an accurate and feasible budget, rather than kind of going whole hog and asking for as much as you can, but doing your due diligence and researching, the individual line items you're asking for, the materials, the equipment, thinking through your employees' salaries, things like that. It's going to call for some finesse and some nuance to that budget development. So, again, working and operating within a specific range and under a specific cap, I think is going to be really important when you're pulling together your budget. Um, One of the first things I would say is I do think it's always, if it's available, to it's important to track down some of the previous awardee information to kind of look at the awards that have been released in the past, comparing those against the caps or the ranges that are provided, and kind of, estimating what your likelihood of success would be if you ask for the full amount versus kind of, again, playing within or slightly below the maximum that's provided. There's always the alternative of just calling the funding source directly or emailing the funding source for more information, just to get a little bit more information and insight into, your kind of opportunity to win. Um, there's also a formatting perspective as well. So, what format should your budget take? A lot of funding opportunities are going to provide an explicit budget template. I know, for example, Music in Action provides an explicit budget template, but sometimes those budget templates are not provided. It's very easy to find free grant budget templates online just through Googling free budget template, grant budget template. Very easy to track them down, and a lot of times they'll be much more organized than just kind of throwing line items and numbers into an Excel sheet. And again, the other thing I'd recommend here is researching previous awardees as well, seeing if they provided what sort of budget they provided for their grant award, if they had a budget template or something you might be able to kind of use. Ask them to clean out the data, obviously, so you're not using their explicit data. But yeah, always researching just what the previous awardees had done is a really great way to go, since there's a lot of precedent set there with their awards. The next consideration is budget type. So, how much information should you actually include? There are certain funding organizations that will only require a program or a project budget, while others might actually require an organization's overall budget just to take a look at, their financial their financial competency for one, but also just being able to kind of balance what they're asking for versus their overall organization's budget, and if that's reasonable or practical. The budget type will also really heavily depend on the time frame of the grant. So every grant typically has a period of performance to operate within, whether that's a year, 3 years, 5 years, whatever it might be. So considering your ability to kind of project out a budget over that period of performance timeline is really, really important. And understanding kind of, whether it's on a quarterly basis, biannually, an annual basis, what your expenditures might look like, it's going to really help you project out and better understand what your budget's going to look like over those several years. And then the fourth big part of just kind of understanding your funder's requirements is the actual expense types. So, what expenses and numbers are going to be required, or which ones are going to be covered by the grant? Almost all grants are going to cover direct expenses. Obviously, those are the funds that are needed to run the program or the project that you're proposing. So I like to kind of just think of these as what I call noun costs. So it's just considering persons, places, or things that are going to be needed to run the program, whether that's materials and equipment, whether that's employees or potentially contractors, things like that are always going to be those direct expenses that are required to initiate your proposed grant project. There's also opportunities sometimes for indirect expenses, and these are typically overhead costs to either run the organization or run the place of business. So, how do you keep the lights on? How do you keep the waters running? Things like that. There are a lot of grants that will allow a certain percentage of indirect costs to be covered. Sometimes it's as much as 15%. Sometimes it's as little as 5%. But generally, most grants will allow some type of indirect cost to be captured within your grant proposal. So be sure that you kind of have a good understanding of what indirect costs will be allowed and be able to be captured in your budget. So step two, once you kind of understand the funder's requirements, is understanding your team's requirements. So beginning to work with your team to estimate what are just kind of perceived as realistic costs. And realistic costs are just most often supported by real data, whether that's from your organization or whether that's, from just Googling things online to understand what, maybe a generator costs in reality versus kind of just an estimate, getting quotes, things like that. The thing to understand here and why it's so important to kind of have these realistic costs is overestimated costs will oftentimes either make you and your organization appear wasteful, or it'll signal to kind of a savvy grant writer or a grant maker or awarder that you have inefficient operations, and they need to better understand why you're inflating or overblowing certain costs. Again, it's very easy to Google, hey, a generator costs $6,000, and if someone's proposing $20,000, that's a very, very quick way to indicate, yeah, okay, this person might be overestimating a lot of their costs. Um, Underestimating costs is also something to really consider. So it is, I understand, completely walking a tightrope of kind of playing the difference between overestimating and underestimating. But underestimating costs, I think, will create a lot of doubt. Sometimes it will, um, kind of create some concerns for those grant makers, doubting estimates, and it may also really hurt you in the long run because it might result in a heavily reduced budget to get a program or a project completed. That's going to create some significant difficulties for you, especially if, a lot of times, and I can speak again, largely to federal grants. Once that money's been earmarked, you generally can't go back to a federal agency and ask for more money. They will definitely expect you to cover any sort of overruns on whatever you've proposed. So just consider that, you may have an award that's provided, but then you may have to cover a whole ton of cost above that cost that was provided because you've underestimated what actually, implementing that program or project will be. Um, so this again is where just coming in and conducting a detailed cost analysis and really outlining what your project is going to cost is really, really important. And, three examples of where you might be able to go out and find these things. One is historical reports. So if you have information of kind of what, implementing, I don't know, again, speaking specifically to Music for Action, if you're proposing, 25 new shows, well, what does it on average cost for you to be able to put on a single show? Can you estimate that over the next 25 using those historical data or those historical reports that you have? Just being able to try to pin down any real numbers you can, I think, is going to be hypercritical when you're pulling together these projects and proposals. The other thing I'd say, again, the power of Google is greatly underestimated sometimes when folks are trying to really guesstimate what certain supplies or certain services are going to look like. You can get consultants costs, you can get quotes, you can get, spec sheets, whatever you need. There's going to be some kind of information available online these days that's going to at least give you a relative ballpark of, what certain services or equipment are going to cost. And then, of course, it's on you generally as a business owner or someone working within a business to estimate and to kind of understand those associated overhead costs. Again, your lighting, your water, whatever it might be. Really kind of honing in what that overhead might look like and projecting into the future is going to be important. So that really all comes down to, gathering together your list of everything you're going to need. What are those noun costs? Like I mentioned, what is your staff, your supplies, your services, and your space going to look like? The four S's, right? So your salaries and your wages for your staff working on the project, your materials and supplies, your equipment costs, if there's travel and transportation involved, if you're renting or leasing a space, if you own a space, what do those utilities look like? Um, Costs associated with monitoring and evaluating the project's progress, and then any expenses for creating and distributing project related materials. So if you're going to have things like merch or tickets or social media engagement, again, you can include those things in your overall program or project budget. And then the other thing I mentioned too is you might want to consider just a diversification of different revenue streams. So a lot of these grant agencies really like to see that it's not just their funds that are exclusive to your individual project, whether that's a consolidation of, potentially other grants, or if there's sponsorships that are available that you might be able to bring in. But I will say, grant writers and funders really, really like to see in-kind matches. So, if you're able to provide funding from your end, and not even just funding, potentially just institutional knowledge, things like that, being able to show that you're bringing more to the project than just the money that's coming explicitly from the grant funder. I think it really, really shows some good faith and really encourages the grant funding resource that, oh, this thing's definitely going to move forward expeditiously and it's going to be something that's going to be achievable. Uh, so step three as well, moving, I guess, into step three, showing the funder exactly what their grant is going to cover. Um, One of the biggest pieces of grant budget development is ensuring cohesion between the budget and the actual grant narrative. So, there's like an exercise when everyone was in elementary where you had like, a word and then like a definition, and you had to draw the lines and connect the words to the definitions. That's essentially what we're trying to do with the budget and the grant narrative. What we're trying to ensure is that a reviewer can basically draw a single line between individual line items of your budget and the narrative that's accompanying it. So, if you're able to identify certain buckets of funding to keep budget line items sort of relatively broad, it affords you the ability to much more easily tie it back to a narrative. So instead of counting, individual nails and screws or whatever might be required, lumber, whatever might be required to pull that project or program together, and saying, this is materials and equipment, and kind of elaborating within your grant narrative what that materials and equipment are. It's going to be much, much easier for that reviewer to kind of connect the dots. The other thing I would mention about that explicitly is if you're using a cost reimbursable grant program, creating a bit more broad categories within your budget narrative is going to make it much, much easier for you to go back and be able to get your costs reimbursed, because you can tie invoicing much more easily to those broader cost categories. Um, the other important part about the cohesion between budget and grant narrative is the ability to provide viable metrics. So if you can show, if you can draw specific lines between the funding and the actual outcomes that are going to be achieved by that funding, like I used a Department of Transportation example here, which is not great, but something like adding 10 miles of bike lanes will equate to X amount of dollars. Or again, I mentioned the number of shows. The number of shows will equate to this amount of money. Being able to provide metrics that the reviewer can see and that you can use as your benchmark later on down the road is really going to help you prove your case that you're achieving the objectives and the goals of your proposed grant. Um, the other thing that you need to do is really demonstrate your knowledge of the funder's requirements, which I mentioned in step one. If a grant doesn't cover overhead costs, show how you're going to pay without using the funder's money, or just ensure that all of these requirements you've written down, you kind of have right next to you. So, when you're developing that budget, you're not including certain things for a reason, or you are including certain things for a reason, and just ensuring that you're kind of checking the boxes of all the requirements that are provided through that grant opportunity or through the notice of funding opportunity. And again, I can't overemphasize this. I think, one of the other extremely important things here is the ability to develop a strong budget narrative. So I usually write budget narratives to just accompany whatever budget I'm providing, even if it's not required as a part of an individual grant opportunity. But it gives you an opportunity to just say, even, set aside from the grant narrative, it gives you an opportunity to make your case on the budget as to why it's reasonable, appropriate, or adequate. It gives you an opportunity to also describe policies that are going to govern your budgetary decisions. It'll provide you essentially a standard operating procedure for how you're going to be spending your money, out of a specific bank account maybe, or what sort of paperwork you're going to be keeping on your end, for audit purposes, like copies of your invoices or copies of cleared checks or things like that. Just building a sort of practice in-house for you to ensure financial responsibility and ensure financial accountability, I think is extremely important. And it allows you to provide detail about certain personnel costs or certain items that are being purchased. And it really gives you a chance to indicate how those costs were calculated. I think, everyone's, especially from the reviewing end, we always want to try to, I talk about this in the grant narrative presentation, but we always want to try to reduce the cognitive burden of the reviewer. So if we can show, that we're providing reasonable information and where we're pulling that reasonable information from. It really helps the reviewer not have to infer, oh, they pulled these costs from here, or they pulled these costs from here, or they pulled these costs from thin air. You have supporting documentation that says, yes, this is where we're getting these from. This is why we're choosing to use this amount of money, and really elaborate on, how you pulled that budget together. And step four, and this one kind of often goes overlooked, to be honest. I have found that QA, QC in general, a lot of times is something that folks are kind of lax on for one reason or another. But getting a professional to review your budget, I think, is just extremely important. And it doesn't need to be, a financial officer. It doesn't need to be an insurance agent or anything like that. It's just someone that has some general knowledge about what you're doing, how you're doing it, and kind of how you run your business. But I think it's just a good practice to have someone that's kind of an external party review your budget just for objectivity. Again, kind of understanding that they might be able to catch certain issues or errors, like maybe you accidentally added an extra zero on a budget item, or, again, asking questions about why you propose certain costs, why certain costs are as much or as little as they are. But just consider reaching out to either peers or colleagues or even just people in the industry that can provide that impartial feedback, and help you identify certain areas that might need further explanation or adjustment, and really just provide an unbiased perspective on kind of the clarity of whatever you're proposing and the general accuracy. And then the last thing I would mention is it's really important to consider contingency in everything that we do. I think, we're kind of living in a world of, you know, change. A lot's going on, nationally and worldwide. Inflation is a huge issue in a lot of ways and probably will continue to be. Logistically, we had a lot of delays in equipment unavailability, especially through COVID, but it's still continuing these days. We're getting, even more hazardous weather, like snowstorms can prevent a lot of these deliveries and things like that on a timely basis. We also had to consider staff changes, right, and rollovers. So it's really important to factor contingencies into your budget, whether they be time contingencies or whether they be cost contingencies. Giving yourself some breathing room, I think, is really, really important. Um, Most grant opportunities I've seen will, especially on a federal level, will explicitly allow certain contingency within a budget, sometimes up to 10%, sometimes even more. I think it's a pretty reasonable starting point to consider 10% contingency, but if there are grant opportunities that explicitly say they don't allow contingency, I would always recommend kind of baking this into your budget items. So as you develop your grant budget, I would add 10 to 15% on top of those individual line items. Again, just to give yourself some breathing room. Um, Including that contingency really just ensures, you have a financial safety net that's going to allow you to address any unexpected challenges or changes, industry-wide or individual wise. I think it's a smart decision and definitely something that should be included. So what happens when you won? So if you've kind of gone through all this, you've written a great grant, you've gotten it approved, you've gotten your award letter and your award package from your authorizing agency, what then? Number one, I think, is going to be your ability to track expenditures, right? Understanding kind of how to develop effective expenditures tracking is a huge linchpin of not just sound grant budgeting, but also just sound financial responsibility, and ensuring that those funds are being expended appropriately. I always recommend creating a digital ledger essentially immediately to help you log any transaction that's spent out of that grant funding amount. So you have some kind of ability to keep track of, the checks that are being written or the equipment that's being purchased, or the salaries that are being paid explicit towards the program or the activity being initiated. Maintaining those receipts receipts and supporting documentation for any of those expenditures is hyper critical. And having that ledger allows you to kind of one-to-one, any of those receipts or documentation that's been pushed out. You can keep track of it and just throw everything into a single folder. I always kind of make an individual folder on my desktop, explicit to every single grant that I'm working in. And as stuff rolls in or rolls out, I can just kind of like PDF everything, throw it in the folder, and organize it at a later date. But at least give myself an opportunity to track things while I can. I realize this sounds more intense than it really is, but I would also recommend, instituting some sort of regular audit process while you're moving through your grant cycle. Some people do it monthly. I would recommend it quarterly at most. Just allowing yourself to kind of catch up and make sure that you haven't missed anything. If something might have slipped through the cracks, just kind of comparing your financial activity to the information you do have in that digital ledger, and ensuring that all those transactions are logged and you haven't missed one or two. It's just going to make things a lot easier. Sometimes when you have to close those grants out, a lot of times when you close grants out, you'll be required to provide financial information showing what you've spent. And then also, like I said, if you're working in a world of federal grants, that's like a cost reimbursable program. On a quarterly basis, you're going to have to be delivering, financial information. So it's important to just continuously keep that info organized. Assigning those expense categories, this goes back to your large buckets of funding, which again ties into just the budget development in general. If you keep them more and more broad, you'll be able to assign those expense categories much more easily, and it won't be, super detailed. You can just kind of throw everything into individual buckets. And then with labor costs, that becomes a little bit more difficult because, again, it's kind of up to you to use some sort of time tracking tool to ensure that the salaries that are being paid are reasonable. You're not paying a full year's salary. You may just be paying portions of it, right, for explicit hours that have gone towards a project or just an individual's time. And then the reconciliation of those bank statements, like I mentioned, with that ledger, it just allows you to catch any of those discrepancies up front, so you don't have to go back and dig through tons and tons of information. Especially if you get a year down the road, it can be a real pain to try to catch up and figure out where everything is. And again, I mean, I think just in general, from an audit perspective, it begins with those robust internal controls and just understanding that, when you're diving into this, it's important to introduce those standard operating procedures for any of your financial activities. I do this as part of the budget narrative before the grant award is ever even made. So it just gives you an opportunity to kind of lay out what you might put in place. You can make it as detailed or as least detailed as you would like, but it just provides some sort of opportunity for you to regularly review your procedures and controls and just cultivate a culture of transparency and accountability, not just on the grant, but more generally. I think within your team, it gives you an opportunity to show everyone what you're doing. And I think the more informed you can make your staff and your team, the better off everyone's going to be, right? So, lastly, tips and tricks. This is again just my recommendations. It's what I've sort of dealt with over time and what I've learned. But the do nots, again, the number one I would say is do not discredit the budget narrative. Making that budget format as clear as possible and beginning with your budget narrative. Well, I'm sorry, beginning writing your budget narrative after your budget's been prepared, I think is really important because it'll allow you to go line by line through your budget and explain why you're incorporating certain line items into that budget, certain categories into that budget, and just give you an opportunity to kind of do your own due diligence and your own QA/QC to really understand, the cost feasibility of what you're proposing and why. Don't anticipate that the grant income is going to be the sole support for your project. I would again consider this when developing your overall budget requirements. Consider inflation is going to be a major part of whatever you're developing. And again, understand that odds are you're going to likely have to provide a certain amount of funds out of your own pocket. Understand feasibly what you can potentially provide out of your own pocket, and really, kind of even sort of earmark that or set it aside in a separate account should the need arise. You don't want to be in a position where you're unable to achieve the goals and objectives of what you proposed, because a lot of times, and I hate to say this, but again, especially with federal agencies, if they are unable to see that you've completed the objectives or the program or project that you've proposed, they will, retroactively strip away the remaining funds that have been unspent. And no one wants that to happen. It happens very rarely, but it does happen. So I would just be very, very aware of that and ensure that you have the ability to support, any of those or inflationary costs should the need arise. Uh, Also, just start thinking really, really early on about your budget requirements. So think about it in anticipation of a solicitation. Review the solicitation from last year, if it's available. A lot of these programs have been up and running for several years, so there will be information out. What they did last year, if you can get your hands on a funding opportunity from last year, or again, identify folks that have been funded in the past. Just get a really good understanding of what was required of those folks that were awarded in the past, or just get a really good understanding of what the expectation was from the solicitation last year. Start developing your budget early, get out ahead of it, have a bunch of folks review it if you can, and ensure that you're checking the individual boxes of those different opportunities or announcements. Things change year over year. Priorities shift in different agencies and things like that, but generally, these programs don't change that significantly. So a lot of the information will remain largely the same. So, it'll at least give you a foundational basis. I'd say like almost like a 90% completion of a budget, just to kind of, develop your budget based on last year's solicitation. And the number one thing I would say too is, if you do win, immediately set up some kind of separate bank account or a separate system. To ensure that you're spending out of a specific bucket of funds, so you're not mixing it with a bunch of other funding sources, or I guess funding streams, because it's going to create some headaches for you later on from that financial accountability perspective as you're trying to go through individual line items. If you've got everything in one account and you're just spending directly from that account, the only time you're touching that account is when it's related to the individual grant that you applied to. It's going to make it way, way, way easier for you, just accountability wise, to be able to ensure where all that information is coming from and where all those expenditures are going. Um, and the last thing I wanted to share real quick is something that we've mentioned on every call, which is kind of understanding where the actual grants are. My number one source, especially when it comes to federal resources, is going to be grants.gov. This is essentially the primary resource for any and all federal grants. They went through last month basically an entire reorganization of the website. They did a huge update. It's much, much more intuitive from a search perspective. It was really terrible to work with for a number of years, and really difficult to find individual grants, but they made it a lot easier to go through, and to identify individual grants that are going to be specific to you. Um, I can't remember, Sarah. I mentioned this at the beginning of the call, so sorry, Sarah. But the National Independent Venue Foundation just came out with a super, super awesome state funding resources guide that has a ton of information. That's probably going to be very applicable to a lot of the folks on this call. But it provides a lot of really cool workforce development opportunities, a lot of small business information, and it's just a really good resource to gather information about those smaller opportunities, and even some large opportunities. The other thing I mentioned is state, county, and city websites. Definitely do not discredit these. Always kind of keep an eye on them, because a lot of these websites get updated regularly with new grant opportunities, whether they be, like local economic development or arts and culture or small business incubator initiatives. Some of these may support grant opportunities, so be sure to keep an eye on that, and always kind of regularly check in. Maybe set like I don't know, a reminder on your calendar or something like that to just take a peek. And then the last thing is there's a lot of nonprofit and for-profit organizations that already exist that do offer yearly funding cycles. I will openly say a lot of these are generally going to be much more nuanced and sometimes they're going to be, smaller amounts. You're not going to be finding the $1 million grants usually on these types of websites, but there will be, these smaller grant opportunities that can still provide a lot of value and a lot of funding to folks if they're looking for it to kind of carry them into those larger grant cycles. But with that said, that's all I had. Thank you very much. I really, really appreciate it, and I'm happy to answer any questions I can.